Mr. Brady here with a continuation of our series that we're doing on BCCI. And today we're going to kind of focus historically on that type of relationship. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Brady early on, and then I'm going to kind of play second chair in this arrangement for this show and interject the Gladio stuff as he takes us through the banking history that's relative to this conversation. Brady?
Hey, thanks for having me on again. Always a pleasure. I think the way I'm going to do this, just to kind of lay it out, is I'm just going to go through some of the historical connections to organized crime and the banking system. And I'm going to give me some very strategic pauses where I know the Colonel is going to jump in because she'll draw the next connection to where that ties into all the Gladio CIA type operations throughout the years. And the pieces just perfectly fit. It's a pattern that repeats over and over again. And, it's interconnected. So, and I'm going to skip over some of the stuff that I know the Colonel's covered on this channel, like the Green Gang in China, which really, it's an important part of it. And I'm not going to go all the way back to Venice and the history of banking unless you want me to.
No, we're good with that.
Because it's important, but
it is. But just so that everybody knows, because as you just indicated, this topic is huge. But we tend to use the early history, late 1800s forward, concentrating on just prior to World War II, and then the post World War II, which you and I've talked about a lot. And just for context and limited amount of time that we have to devote to this. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, a lot of this whole story wraps around government regulation and deregulation. And the first real big banking reform act was in 1934. It's called the Glass-Steagall Act. And that's coming right in the middle of the Great Depression. It was one of the first things FDR's presidency did. But it's one of the better government regulation bills I've seen. Having been at SEC regulated for most of my adult life, the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated retail and commercial banks, was a big deal. And right after that, they created the Investment Company Act of 1934 and a few others that followed. Anytime anybody's sat down for a Series 7 or a Series 6 or any of the securities licenses knows these acts by heart because you got to memorize them. And they actually made some sense. And what they found, after decades of panics and then before the Federal Reserve and then after the Federal Reserve, just a boom and bust was a bit of a problem. And it found what they determined was the busts were usually done by the commercial banks, which were doing, international trading, investing in their own accounts. They're the ones taking the risk, and the retail saver was getting punished. So the Glass-Steagall Act separated those apart, and they made the retail banks highly regulated and the commercial banks less regulated. As you can imagine, that opens up a lot of opportunity. You started seeing the offshore tax havens like Panama and Switzerland start coming back into play. Switzerland would have a major role in both World War I and World War II, where players on both sides would put their assets someplace that was supposedly a neutral country. The big thing with Switzerland was it had always been a haven for French aristocrats back from like 1789, during the French Revolution. During the industrial expansion in the 1800s, a lot of the oligarchs started putting their money in Switzerland. But where they really took off was where they wrote bank secrecy into law in 1934, same year all this other regulations going. And so it's called Article 47 of the Swiss Banking Code, where it says no Swiss journalist could investigate banks, and it's a felony to reveal banking information.
Do you think those two are related?
100%.
Okay.
I think it all connects. I think what you see happen is there's always going to be some kind of a financial market where money that can't be transparent it's got to go someplace to get washed or to be stored outside of the prying eyes of regulators. And whether it's Switzerland, Panama, BCCI, all these different places throughout time, it shifts depending on the lay of the land. But I guess the big picture is that market will always exist. So we get prohibition ends, and of course the mafia's got to find new markets. This is when Lucky Luciano takes over the Five Families in New York. We know all about Operation Underworld, so I won't go into that. What's going on across the world at the time is Shanghai is exploding. We're post opium wars, the opium trade is huge in China, and a lot of that money's funneling through Shanghai. And of course, HSBC enters the picture as the big money laundering bank for the opium smugglers. Let's say,
and Shanghai is under the authority of the UK at this period.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, that's correct.
It's an international settlement.
Yep, and you've got the Green Gang is the biggest opium. That would be the Chinese mafia. They're the biggest opium smugglers in the world. And a guy rises to power there by the name of Du Yusheng. And he got to power by murdering a lot of his competitors, so he's a nice guy. France had a area they were the protectorate of as well, and they actually named this guy Du Yusheng to the Council of Elders. And then he would become the director of the Shanghai Stock Exchange and the Bank of China, all while sitting as the president of the board of opium suppression. Kind of an interesting portfolio Mr. Du Yusheng has. He's the head opium smuggler, and he's also sits on the government board to suppress opium.
For everybody else but them.
Exactly.
Yes, kind of like the CIA. But I digress. Go ahead.
Well, so the Green Gang is, branching into quote unquote legitimate businesses. Little curveball gets thrown at him when Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. So Du Yusheng moves his whole operation himself personally to Hong Kong. And he operates the Green Gang and the opium up until 1949. The OSS got involved about that time. So I'll let you comment on that because you know it pretty well.
Well, that's where people have heard me talk about this. As a matter of fact, we were just talking about it yesterday. When Chiang Kai-shek comes into the picture, he's Paul Helliwell's mentor on how to sell opium, launder the money, and pay for your war machine. And so Paul Helliwell gets the idea that this is a great business model for the new CIA that had just been set up. And they're trying to maneuver Chiang Kai-shek back into China because he's now been pushed out. He's in Burma initially, then gets moved over. Temporarily, he was in charge of the northern sector of Vietnam to Japanese it, however you want to say that, because the Japanese had actually taken over Vietnam, the country. And so they had divided those two sectors. And if you go back in history, it's a misnomer when you read that China was giving the authority, or the responsibility should have been the better word, that in a year they were going to have an election for the entire state of Vietnam. This exact same thing happened in Korea, by the way. But they had divided the country into two because it was too large for one country to do. The UK had the southern province of Vietnam, and Chiang Kai-shek actually had the northern part. But Ho Chi Minh basically kicked him out post haste because he had already began moving the opium flow into northern Vietnam. And he was like, oh yeah, not on my watch. And so they were looking for a place to set him up in business. And so you have him constantly moving around, but the whole thing MacArthur was insistent upon, which is why we went into Korea in the way in which we did on the northern part, is they were going to supplant Chiang Kai-shek there in order to do China death by 1,000 cuts. So they just kept edging around by agitating Tibet, the Uyghurs, everybody. And they've been at this for, the last 70 years.
Well, the interesting connection, and we'll see that ties into what happened decades later, is you have the, underworld, of the opium trade, getting involved in legitimate business and banking with a connection to a U.S. government-backed strongman. And isn't that pretty much the recipe for Gladio right there?
Patterns.
Just a decade before Gladio had ever been invented, they were already doing this. Yep. So, Mao Zedong comes to power and kicks a lot of those bad guys out. They end up in Hong Kong or Taiwan and various other places throughout what became the Golden Triangle. Skipping across the pond or across the world, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement in World War II, which basically made the U.S. dollar the world's reserve currency. That's a big, big deal. Whether you're doing trading, legitimate international trading, or smuggling opium, what have you, at some point in time, your loot or your money is going to have to pass through the dollar system. That's an awful lot of power, and it was given to the United States as opposed to the former reserve currency, of course, was the British sterling pound. Sorry, the British pound. The United States was the only major economy in the world that was untouched by two world wars, and that gave us an awful lot of industrial power. What was interesting is, we did not get out of the Great Depression until the war hit. None of FDR's policies, government spending, worked at all. In fact, we had a double Great Depression in 1937-38. When we go to war, they nationalize the economy, and the United States industrial might just rears its head, and we get ourselves out of the recession and generated an awfully big GDP with a very high tax rate. You get out of World War II, and the United States decision makers had to make a decision. Do we shrink? Do we demilitarize our economy? Or do we find a way to keep this industrial base going? This right here is the impetus for a lot of what you're seeing happen with Gladio and everything that our intelligence agencies have done. Because it was basically the only way to keep this industrial base as strong as it was during the war, and so we don't go back into recession, was to export everything we could make. And we had to have healthy economies in Europe especially, but also throughout Asia. And that's why you started seeing these things like the Marshall Plan, giving United States and World Bank loans for help rebuilding of Europe and other places around the world have been decimated by the war. As you can imagine, a lot of that money gets caught into the whole graft game. There's payoffs and payoffs all the way down the chain. So, but it did work. It allowed the U.S. industrial base to get off military production and go into goods and services. And we basically saw an economic boom out of that in America as the rest of the world.
I'm going to take exception to get off military because we never got off of that, right?
Yeah, it's a matter of scale.
We added to it.
Well, I think the graph I saw, it says like in 1945 or 44, something like 73% of the U.S. GDP was in military, and obviously that was not going to be sustainable. So, right. So you retracted. Well, although, yeah, you're right. They never stopped. The military-industrial complex has to feed too, right?
Yeah, and it helps when you take over entire countries with the machine.
Yeah, it certainly does. Cheap resources forever.
Yes.
So here's what gets fun. The next iteration of where the mafia gets involved. There's a Italian tax lawyer and banker by the name of Michael Sindona, and or might be Michele. I can't. It's spelled Michele. Should be more of a household name. He ended up being a banker for the mafia in the Vatican, but I'll get to that. He came out of Milan, which was becoming a post-war industrial hub. And Sindona becomes a banker for the rich people who wanted to hide their income. And it worked in Milan because it sits there in the northwest corner of Italy, which is very near the border of both Switzerland and Liechtenstein, two banking havens. So as you can imagine, the opportunity there, it was too much to resist. What you found in Italy is if you had a company, you'd have 5 sets of books. One for the taxmen, one for the banks, one for the minority shareholders, one for the board of directors, and one that was actually the true books. And it was very common. They had all their shell companies and holding companies, and they used bearer-backed shares and every fun little money-hiding trick in the world. And Milan and this guy Sindona became a master at it, creating shell companies and under shell companies across borders, moving currencies left and right. And he made a pretty good fortune doing it. He got so good that he becomes the banker for the mafia. Obviously, well, we talked about this bit yesterday, so I'll bring it up again. At the time, the mafia, we're talking 1950s here, late 40s, 50s, the mafia is opposed to what was called the Italian communists. I will pass the baton to you.
So Brady and I were talking yesterday about the flow, the agenda today, kind of an outline. And we got into whether or not there was actually a communist presence in Italy. And the first book that I read, Paul Williams, Operation Gladio, talks about the Red Brigade. He doesn't spend a lot of time dissecting it as to whether it was legitimately a communist-based entity. So, at book 40 into this, and I find out that most of the things that this apparatus called Operation Gladio, lazed as communist, like putting a pointer on it. And the label communist allowed the entire national security apparatus to be mobilized in an attack mode, whether it's a finding signed by the president to assassinate the communist president, or whether it's to authorize a Contra type operation because there's communists running around the country. That label was used and misused primarily across the board. So I got to thinking, I wonder if it was misused in Italy, since we now have a pattern established, by book 40, that no one they actually called communist was really communist. So I went back and I started doing research in Italy about the court cases that were tried after 1990 revelation that Operation Gladio was a thing. And what you find decades later, in some cases, people were being sent to jail that were not communists at all, but had infiltrated the Red Brigade and instigated the entire thing. And one of their mechanisms for doing that was this issue around labor. And because it dovetails into everything we're talking about, in America, when you had all of the trust breakups in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you had this is just because I just keep seeing patterns in my head. So we know that they took imperialism and basically just revamped it. So all of this is imperialistic, but we've used NGOs to do what the State Department had done in the 1920s and 30s when we took in the late 1800s when we took over Hawaii, right? So it's all imperialism. It just takes a different form. It's all the same thing. So if they find out that labeling people as communists works, then they're going to keep doing it. And if you look at the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping, you had the entire thing was an FBI operation. They just found gullible people walking on the street or talking in signal and put them in to be able to color them as some type of a criminal so you can hide the FBI presence, which drove the entire thing. And if you take that scenario and you impose it on the country of Italy, what they did was they took, Mussolini had just been gotten rid of. The oligarchs, because Italy was basically a fascist country. Mussolini was the figurehead government guy, and all of the business families ran the country. They ran Mussolini as well. And so you have everybody that was labor was getting like, $1 a day. So they began to form coalitions of labor in order to be able to try to craft a government that pulled the power away from the oligarchs in Italy and gave some of the power back to the people. Well, those were immediately by the same vanguard oligarchs labeled communist. Were they communist, or did they just want workers' rights? And where I struggle with this is I look at America going back to the breaking up of the trust. All America did was pretend to have labor unions, and they pretend to have trade associations, and they pretend not to have oligarchs, right? That's all an illusion. The trade unions are owned by the oligarchs, and the union stewards, the union presidents are owned by the oligarchs too. All they did was take what was in the old trust and put two facades up called a labor union and a trade associations, and they own the same thing. They just have 23 of them and make it pretend. And that's the same thing that they've done with imperialism. They pretend behind the wall of the World Wildlife Fund and all of these NGOs, National Endowment for Democracy, like they're not imperialistic powers when they still are, because they own these countries that they go in and basically privatize into all of these oligarch buckets. So my research and going back looking through court cases of who was found guilty of being infiltrated into the Red Brigade, and like the The Red Brigade was initially charged with the murder of Matei. Do you know who he is?
I don't.
Matei, I think you spell his name Mateo. He was the guy in the Italian government that was like the state-owned energy guy. Okay, so he's like the Department of Energy for the country of Italy. He had this philosophy that he was going to change the way they did business with Africa. He was going to give them fair deals. They were getting oil from Algeria, and he was going to renegotiate the Italian contracts with them and give them a 50-50 split, which had never been done from any European country. And they blew him up. They blew up his airplane and killed him. So initially that investigation was found that it was just a mechanical, bad luck for him. After Gladio began being revealed in Italy, a reporter, went back and went, hey, what about this guy? He got blown up and he was doing good for the African countries. So they went back and got this guy's body and they examined the inside of his gold ring. It had fragments from a bomb blast. And they confirmed that he had in fact been blown up. And they confirmed that people that were from Gladio trained entities inside of Italy that had buried themselves in the Red Brigade and were pretending to be communists were the people that blew them up.
You draw some interesting parallels, and I'm going to circle back to the premise of what you just said. Is we knew that the mafia was very happy to fight against fascists, and we also know that they've been very pleased to fight against communism. But you talk about the what's quote unquote communism. You've got an element of actual communism in the labor unions. You've got an element of actual communism in that Italian movement, but that element's at the very lowest levels. And that is because the idea of communism and all this equality, that is nothing but a marketing piece. With the people actually calling the shots, it's always been about power. Who's going to have power? And we're determined that. With the mafia, we're just speaking about Italy and America and the trade unions, you would not expect that the mafia organization would work well with our socialist or communist movements, but those are still at the very low levels. It's a big part of the labor movement. So it's interesting you bring it up. I think there's more to dig on this, dig deeply into it. What was the other thing I was going to touch on? You can go on, continue. I'll get back to it.
Well, that was just my point in explaining. And again, I think you have to go back because of the image that you and I, because of the time period we grew up in, of defining what is communism. Because to me, there's a distinct difference between workers' rights and government control of an economy, which is basically what I view communism as. It's
that would be the Bolshevism that international communism became versus the utopian version that most people foresee, unfortunately.
Yeah, so to me, workers' rights should not be equated to communism. Workers' rights should be a part of the negotiation, and not under a union, by the way, necessarily. Workers' rights in a economic model has to be part of an equation for a business owner in order to be a productive part of society as a whole. You can't have slaves and say that you're a functioning economy. So you can take business and labor and you can work together. To me, allowing labor at the table is not a form of communism. It's a form of negotiation, as long as that's not infiltrated with the mafia and some of the connotations that has been taken over here in the United States.
Yeah, I think you have two different forces working towards this on the same goal, because there's no coincidence that the rise of the labor movement in America absolutely corresponded with the rise of the Fabian socialists here.
Correct.
And so you have two different things working towards the same means, and that's where we got today. We got this to today. And we've seen the pattern. You talk about communism. You call anyone communist, it's an excuse The Red Menace. It's an excuse for us to, have military intervention or other. It's like we've started wars or toppled governments to protect democracy. What does that even mean? We've done it for national security, our national interests. These are the buzzwords that our politicians and media use to justify all kinds of shenanigans in foreign countries.
Correct.
If they told the truth and said, no, we don't like this guy because he's not letting our multinational corporations exploit your labor and resources,
yes,
Americans might be a little more reluctant to back the war machine.
You think?
Yeah. So that's why that's why the military industrial complex, Pentagon, CIA, State Department, they've been into marketing and brainwashing and CIA. I listened to RFK Jr. just yesterday, and he made a great speech. And every single time he talked about a threat to our democracy. And, even Donald Trump talks about our democracy. Until we change that language, this country's in a lot of trouble because we are not a democracy, nor do we want to be.
Correct.
It'll always end in tyranny.
Correct.
All right, jumping back to banks. So we've got Sindona. He goes to New York City in the 50s, builds up a bunch of networks, gets to know a bunch of right-wing politicians, New York bankers, becomes a banker for the Gambino family. It's kind of a big deal. And he was part of the big move with the mafia to move to Cuba. He got to be buddies with Batista, set up banks there. Meyer Lansky was a partner. And they were trying to set up organized crime governments where, the whole government became organized crime. And they just built this fantasy world for consenting adults. The big bank Sindona builds in Cuba is called the Bandis Development Bank. And what they did is they used debt financing, so public-private financing for infrastructure projects. They put up like 28 hotels in a 5-year period, 5 new casinos. And this is money coming from, Sicily. It's money coming from the New York mafia, money coming from the Jewish mafia in America. And they're totally in cahoots with Batista in Cuba. Until, segue.
Until Batista gets overthrown by Fidel Castro. And we also went over this yesterday because this is going to be Mythbuster Day. Again, I was full on to the brainwashing in that, everything that my government had ever told me about communists and who the communists were was legitimate, and only to find out that whole bubble got burst. So the same thing with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. So my research into Operation Gladio took me to the coup that happened now obviously the CIA brought, and the mafia brought Batista to power in an initial coup of Cuba. And most people don't understand at that time. You think of the Shangri-La kind of environment in Cuba, where there's casinos down there and mafia, and Frank Sinatra goes down there and sings like a little dog on a leash, and life's great. What you don't realize is they had basically infiltrated Cuba and did what they do everywhere else. They had bought up all of these large sugar plantations. They had taken over the airline. As a matter of fact, the guy that owned the airline was the guy that gave all of the aircraft and ships to Chiang Kai-shek over in Taiwan. His name's William Polly. And he also owned sugar plantations. He owned the bus line throughout the entire country of Cuba. But he's one of many millionaires that got rich off of basically corrupt Batista land deals that stole the people's land. And this Cuban exile group that came and wreaked havoc in Florida and all over the country as a matter of fact, because they blew up a former ambassador in downtown DC and killed American. So these former exiles that the CIA trained as paramilitary terrorists in our own Operation Gladio operators came from the elite families in Cuba that had been bought off and sold their fellow countrymen out. So the only people that initially left Cuba, and I'm not saying Fidel Castro is a good guy, don't get me wrong here. What I am saying is that the only people that initially left Cuba when he initially took over, because he had his sights beaded on them, was the people that sold out the fellow Cubans. Those were these elite people in bed with the mafia that William Polly had working for him, that were kind of like the middle class, upper middle class people. like Felix Rodriguez. Look into that man's background. He was not a poor guy. He was in a boarding school in New York. His parents were so well off in Cuba that they sent their son to a boarding school. All of his siblings went to boarding schools. They were very wealthy, and they got wealthy off of the mafia going down there who was prostituting little kids to include little boys to perverts. They brought all of the vices that the normal mafia brings, the gambling and all of that other stuff. They were paying people jack crap to work. And they had basically taken over the entire island. Plus, to add insult to injury, and what really sent Castro and his fellow countrymen over the top, it became the Sicily drug stop into the United States for the Golden Triangle opium heroin market. All of the cutting and final processing of the heroin that was coming into the United States in the 50s was going through Cuba.
Yeah, it's important to remember, I don't think we point this out enough, an awful lot of those drugs were coming through on U.S. military cargo planes.
Correct.
So the Pentagon at this point in time, Operation Underworld had happened in the 1940s. So here we have it 15 years later, and the mafia has not lost its grip on the Pentagon at all in any way, shape, or form. The first time Lucky Luciano, the first people he worked with the U.S. government was military intelligence.
Maybe.
It's where they got their grips into. Said something interesting that I just dropped my mind.
Well, let me go back to the Che Guevara thing, because that was a sticking point yesterday. So when you have all of this backdrop going on, and Castro being an attorney and Che Guevara was a doctor, got together and figured out, because at this point, Batista is backstabbing the CIA and their drug market, right? So he's kind of branching out on his own and kind of puffing up his chest, as most of these dictators like Noriega eventually does, and piss off the benefactor whose hand is stuck out there. So the CIA, in every one of these cases where they put a strongman in, they've got their predecessor already picked out. So when they go off the reservation or they threaten somebody to reveal stuff that they're not supposed to, they're gone. They'll assassinate them too. And so basically Castro is, whether he's approached or approaches the CIA, he basically works out a deal with the CIA, and the CIA begins giving them weapons because Batista is now on their shit list. So Castro and Che Guevara go into the mountains, and they basically set up a terrorist training camp like Gladio is. And they start launching operations against the government, Batista, out of this training area. And what I have found specifically about Che Guevara is, in every instance of Operation Condor, which was the overthrowing of all of the governments in Latin America, to include Central America, Che Guevara shows up. And he always shows up on the peasants' side of the fight. The people whose entire villages are being burned to the ground by the CIA. He always shows up in defense of the indigenous Indians in Brazil, the Paraguayans, the Uruguayans, the Nicaraguans, every single time. Che Guevara's money, because he came from a very wealthy family, was being used to help the indigenous people throw off the CIA operations and their attempt to allow the oligarchs to come in and rape and pillage. Now, you can paint him any way you want as far as his tactics and everything else, but I no longer have the same opinion of Che Guevara that I did when I started this research. And I'll go to the last step, where Felix Rodriguez is in the room when Che Guevara is murdered. The people that were on site that have now documented what happened, they started at his feet. They shot bullet holes into his extremities, his legs, his arms, and then finished him in the head. He died one of the most gruesome deaths at the hands of the CIA. And Felix Rodriguez admitted he was in the room. He has never admitted he pulled the trigger, but there are people that said that it was him that did it.
Interesting. You got me thinking thinking I'll rethink Che a little bit. I'm a little curious how he ended up in all these spots if he was on the hit list or the what list. Going back to William Pauly, I read something recently that described him as the CIA's first private contractor, and I think that's accurate. First intelligence private contractor was William Pauly, doing their dirty work that they didn't want to do, that the government couldn't do overtly.
Well, they did it overtly many times, but yes, he definitely was. But you could kind of question whether or not. I mean, so this is another gray area. What do you call the people that set up the CIA front companies under the Wilson guy, under the auspices of, I'm going to take a percentage of the proceeds of this front company business and enrich myself, but I'm under the protection of the CIA the entire time. So you can call that a private entity, but it comes with all of the benefits of actually being a government employee, because they're never going to prosecute you.
Yeah, for the most part, right. Comes with a lot of, we just talked about that with BCCI, and that's what we're going to get to is, correct, why didn't anybody above a regional branch manager get prosecuted?
Correct.
So that's the second half of the show today. Oh yeah, okay. So what I was talking about, the big theme here is there's always got to be a market for some kind of a currency or the ability to move money without the scrutiny of regulators. Whether that be the British pound, whether that be the US dollar. It doesn't matter. They don't care. Today, a lot of this stuff is being done with Bitcoin. And you just have to have that kind of market. And because you're talking about illicit money comes from illicit deeds, you have to have some kind of banking or tax haven. We talked about Liechtenstein. We talked about Switzerland. It was Shanghai for a bit. And it always seems to shift. Cuba seemed to be a haven for it. So we're in the 1960s. And this guy, Sindona, goes back to Palermo, Sicily, and comes out of there. He becomes the banker for the entire La Cosa Nostra. That's the big version of the mafia, headquartered, of course, out of Sicily. What he's doing is he's investing their money in these various tax havens. Again, Liechtenstein and Switzerland, setting up shell corporations of trusts, and there's all kinds of the spider web. And he's trying to make money for an awful lot of people, and he is managing a ton of money. In 1963, Sindona becomes friends with a guy by the name of Cardinal Montini, or a little before 63, because in 1963, Montini becomes Pope Paul VI, and Sindona becomes the banker for the Holy See. Right then, the Vatican is spending a lot of money throughout the world for various purposes through something called the IOR. Are you familiar?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the Istituto per le Opere di Religione. That's my Italian accent.
Which is basically like their State Department.
Yeah, the Institute for the Work of Religion. It was founded in 1942. We're going to bust some myths today, right?
1942? The same year Hitler started using Gladio units. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, interesting. So let's bust a myth here. You've heard this 1871 U.S. corporation theory where they say that the United States coming out of the Civil War was bankrupt and we basically became the U.S. corporation as we sold the country to the City of London and the Vatican Bank. Well, that was going to be really hard to do in 1871, considering the Vatican Bank wasn't founded until 1942. Well, that would have been Hitler's bank, Hitler's Pope, and like that. I could go really deep into what the City of London really is or isn't, but it was basically, it's a 1.1 square mile part of London, and it is a municipal corporation, actually the oldest municipal corporation in the world. DC is also a municipal corporation. What the City of London is not is, it's many things. What would come out of the 60s is the City of London would be a wonderful place to have this exchange of international money, because right there, you're sitting there with the dollar being a world exchange currency, and you trade it in London, U.S. regulators have no oversight because it's outside U.S. borders. And because it's in a U.S. currency and not a British currency, the British regulators couldn't do anything. So the City of London in the 60s and 70s becomes this huge center of global commerce. And it actually rivaled New York as the biggest banking center in the world. And it's been going back and forth for 4 decades. and it's just because of very peculiar, set of regulations that are mostly made by British lawmakers and American lawmakers. Makes you wonder how those things kind of happen.
And the Vatican Bank shared some very similar hands-off qualities, as did the banks inside the City of London.
Yes. You have foreign investors borrowing dollars from British banks. London's creating a financial no man's land. They can shift money with almost zero scrutiny. It's really a new empire. Like half the world's banking is going through that. And then, of course, they outsource it to places like the Channel Islands. All sorts of different islands pop up, the Cayman Islands. And they're fully aware that they're breaking UK banking regulations.
But they don't have any authority.
Yeah. Well, Sindona's depositing a lot of the Vatican money in London at this point through dummy corporations. And he really just became so the way I heard it described in one article is now you had the servant of the underworld becomes the financier of God.
And so are we going to talk about Marcinkus?
Go ahead. I don't have a whole lot on that.
All right. Marcinkus is the Archbishop of Chicago. No corruption there. And he does his banking at a mafia-ran bank in Chicago. So Marcinkus is basically in bed with the mafia in the United States. It was called the Illinois Continental Bank or something like that. And so a lot of money laundering going on there. And you have Marcinkus get selected to be in charge of the IOR. He comes into the Vatican right about the time that the Vatican becomes the money laundering destination for the Paul Helliwell apparatus that has been set up in the Golden Triangle with Chiang Kai-shek. And so basically in the original structure, the Vatican was getting all of the money to launder. But this empire grew so big so quickly. And with the war on drugs of the Nixon administration in the early 1970s, they took out the French mafia, the Corsican mafia that had the monopoly on the number 4 heroin refinement there. And they shifted that. So Nixon's war on drug was actually a war on competition, just like we were alluded to earlier. So they knocked out they literally killed all of the top 3 echelons of the Corsican mafia in drive-by shootings, assassination in restaurants. It was bloody murder along the Marseille coast part right there. And so they move all of the refinement of or processing of the number 4 heroin down to Sicily. And that brought all of the world market that was going to be eventually going into Europe and into the US under the control of the CIA using Sicily and the Vatican Bank.
Yeah, I'm just curious if there's any coincidence or because of the overlap between the Corsican Mafia, the war against Corsican Mafia, and of course the CIA having multiple assassination attempts on de Gaulle in France at the time.
What? Well, actually, the assassination attempts on de Gaulle were prior to this because the guy that Nixon is working with was a different guy, a different president.
So the Corsican Mafia was taken out what year?
Around the early 70s.
Okay, so I was thinking about mid-60s, and that's where I went with that.
Yeah.
But France was definitely a fun player there. Where we at? Okay, so now we get to the Bahamas. So after Cuba shut down in the 1960s, these players want to find a new Caribbean home, and they decide on the Bahamas. And Meyer Lansky goes over there with some others. Who else is involved in that? Sedona is, of course, involved. It becomes an offshore banking center. It had been back in Prohibition, and the mob moved to the Bahamas after Castro. There's a group of white-collar criminals that were kind of running the Bahamas called the Bay Street Boys. Well, main one is a guy by the name of Stafford Sands. They tried to set up a whole new, Cuba on Grand Bahama, which wasn't much of an island before they started pumping money into it. And they tried to create a whole new casino complex. The Bay Street Boys, the white-collar criminals, they got gambling legalized in Bahamas. U.S. regulators kept trying to get information. So Sands installed some bunch of bank secrecy laws. There was no taxes in the Bahamas till 1990. It became a huge mecca for all of this international trade, whether it be drug trafficking or money laundering. The Colombian cartels get involved there, and this is the environment that exists on the international banking system when BCCI is about to get founded.
Mm-hmm.
Big thing happened in 71. Nixon takes us off the gold standard. Bretton Woods agreement pretty much died. Sedona's trying to purchase Franklin National Bank in the U.S., which isn't going to happen. And of course, we know what's going on in Italy. Big street violence in the 70s, which is the newspapers are going to say is mafia versus communist. There was a lot of political violence going on in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to say there's probably 4 or 5 different factions. The way the media reported it is probably less than honest. This is all part of the story.
What you end up having, especially, there was a war on, so you have the Gladio things obviously set up in the late 40s. You have all of the 1950s where they have infiltrated and set up networks all over. There were like 600 units and like 400 weapon caches just in Italy alone. Now, they have manipulated everything. They've manipulated the government. They've manipulated media. They've manipulated local governments. And people are getting sick of it. And a couple of journalists begin in the mid 1960s investigating this because they're seeing patterns. If a prosecutor brings a case against anybody affiliated with Gladio, because you haven't mentioned the P2 Lodge yet either. The P2 Lodge was the backbone. There were over 900 government officials that belonged to this Masonic lodge that was with the Knights of Malta and the Vatican. They're all aligned. And anytime a deal went through that a reporter reported on accurately, that reporter was murdered. If the investigator, the prosecutor, a judge began investigating the murder of the journalist or the incident that required the journalist to be murdered, they were assassinated. I lived there. I got there in 1990, and that was when Gladio broke open. 2nd of August, 1990 is the announcement that Gladio's a thing. It's been here since the late 40s. Oh my God, we're so sorry. In just the initial exposure, there were 5 between judges and prosecutors walking into a courthouse in Sicily to try one of the very first people, all assassinated on the steps of the courthouse. They were not going to let any of this get exposed.
Yeah, it took a lot of cross-Atlantic cooperation to finally get there, to finally get it exposed. We talked a little bit about some of these Italian investigators that, risking their life, actually exposed more of this than their American counterparts. Falcone.
Literally.
Yeah. Going back to Nixon taking us off the dollar, so off the gold standard. So now the dollar is free floating against gold. It has lost its value, is to be the de facto currency for all these transactions. Any guesses to what replaced it? Because there has to be a nature abhors a vacuum. Something is going to step into that gap and say this is going to be the commodity or thing that can be traded. For thousands of years, that was gold. Gold's very impractical. Then we had the British pound. Then we had the U.S. dollar. So what became next, starting in 1971? Do you know?
Oil.
Oil's part of it, but more importantly, because oil's hard to transport. Oil contracts, we're not quite there yet. It was the U.S. Treasury note, Treasury bonds. So what you had happen, every single country started having to keep reserves of U.S. Treasuries to be able to facilitate cross-border trade. Well, at the same time, this created a huge demand for the U.S. Treasury and allowed the United States to borrow money and print, quote unquote, print money at an unprecedented scale. It is no coincidence that our M2 money supply goes skyrocketing and inflation of the 70s and 80s hits, basically because of that. But that taking the dollar off the gold standard allowed the U.S. Treasury to be the most freely traded commodity in the world. And it's all squeaky clean because it's got to come from bank to bank. You're brokerage to brokerage. You no longer trade your bonds and certificates, or very, very rarely do you do. So that had a lot of impacts we're feeling today. That opened the door for this excessive borrowing, the unnatural demand for the U.S. Treasury bond. And if that ever unwinds, America is going to find its purchasing power down by 25 to 30% minimum. So,
and don't you think BRICS is going to unwind that?
To some degree, BRICS is a long ways away from having that kind of financial power. They also have a bit of a trust issue, not meaning the United States, has been a trustworthy custodian of being. The problem is the different countries in the BRICS don't necessarily trust each other. Can you trust Chinese accounting? Can you trust, that sort of thing? It's really hard to have a monetary union without a political union. And there's no talk about creating a political union.
Right. Okay.
So I don't think that I think it's important to have competition for the Treasury. And that allows the market to slowly have it dwindle down, as opposed to a complete rip the Band-Aid off.
So let me go back and finish Marcinkus. He moves over to be the Secretary of State in charge of the Vatican Bank. And he is there when Sedona is there. He is there when Calvi gets murdered. And they finally, the country of Italy has had enough of the whole money laundering and the murder. And they decide that they give the Vatican one last chance to clean their crap up. So Marcinkus gets sent on his way. Do you know where he went? Sun City, Arizona. He comes back to the United States basically with a warrant out for his arrest from the country of Italy for the murder of Calvi, the embezzlement of billions of dollars through these shell companies the Vatican set up, all done under his watch. He lives the rest of his life, dies in Sun City with a warrant out for his arrest and an extradition request pending at the State Department that the U.S. never honors.
It's funny how a lot of these people did not end their lives very well. And I was just going to close up on this banking. Sedona ends up arrested in the U.S. in 79 on 68 counts of fraud.
Yeah.
It's because the Franklin National Bank went insolvent because they were making bad loans, apparently. And everyone dropped Sedona. He lost a ton of money for the mafia, a ton of money for the Vatican. And, he ends up dies in jail. Myers-Lansky, who's involved.
Well, he was poisoned in jail. He didn't just die.
Sedona? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But that was better than Calvi, who is the other banker that allowed the National Bank in Italy to go insolvent, because he got hung off the Friars Bridge in London. He was the Bank of Ambrosia or something like that, however you say that, Ambrosiani Bank in Italy. And he was trying to escape being arrested. They find him in London and they hang him off the Friars Bridge in a black with like Masonic stones in his pockets so that they know that it's a hit job.
It's funny. That's a really good segue into the second part of what I want to talk about today, because you point out that these players, they've got a heck of a good life as long as they're useful. And the second they lose their usefulness, it's bye-bye. Nice knowing you. Yeah, exactly. We see the same thing on the government side. People who are willing to look the other way and say they're part of the game, they get to fail upstream and get promoted. And then they get to take their mini vacations to the private sector or the NGO sector, where they get to accumulate a lot of more wealth than they do in the government. And they go in and out of government. That's the revolving door we talk about.
As long as they're useful.
And as long as they play the game. And it does not. This is consistent in America throughout the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, through administrations of both. This goes back decades. If you're willing to play the game, there's a place there. They will find a place for you. And it's the whole government isn't corrupt. It's the people in the bottleneck positions, the political appointments. And you don't get the political appointment unless you're part of the game.
But I will say there's instances of people like Ed Wilson being one of them that played the game, and he was willing to continue to play the games, but he had way too many secrets that he knew. And a new administration comes in and, sorry, you're in jail. And that happens to weapons dealers who did deals for the last administration that the new administration doesn't trust. So you're taking a huge risk when you do business with the United States, because like in the case of the president of Pakistan that was involved in the whole shady dealings with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which isn't what happened at all, and funneling billions of dollars into Afghanistan, but not really, because about 60% of that is shaved off and sent other places. When you're the president in Pakistan that's allowing all that to happen, and you get a new administration in and your airplane blows up, taking with you several Americans that happen to be the ambassador and the general in charge that knew what was going on, they didn't have a change of heart. They just outlived their usefulness.
Well, that's exactly correct. We started this series of BCCI, and the thing we both probably noticed right away is, well, it's great that they caught these 10 mid-level managers in Tampa, Florida, but the investigation never went further. You know, it seemed to be hard capped. It seemed that the U.S. Treasury and the DOJ were slow walking it.
Like Epstein?
Go figure. So I decided to do a little bit of digging and figure, who, we already talked about the connection between Bob Mueller and John Kerry. For those who didn't see that, it turns out that Robert Mueller, who was running the DOJ connection with the BCCI investigation, and John Kerry, who's running the Senate investigation. Yeah, exactly. Well, it turns out that they grew up not even an hour from where I'm sitting right here in Concord, New Hampshire, and were high school lacrosse teammates, which is a little bit too coincidental. Tells me they might have had more than a professional relationship. So, but I wanted to look into, who were the decision makers at the time? Well, who were in the positions? Who were the attorney generals during the BCCI scandal in the late 80s, early 90s? And who were the secretaries of the Treasury? And I'm going to start going through the list of people and some of the connections they have. And you're going to have a field day connecting some dots here. If I may.
Go.
All right. So the attorney general, who's basically in charge of the Department of Justice, who should have been investigating BCCI, and there's going to be three of them that overlaps this 5 or 6 year time period. We're basically looking at 1985 to 1991 or two. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, the big name, who's the U.S. Attorney General in 1985 through August 1988, was a guy by the name of Edwin Meese. Meese came out of he worked under some interesting background things on Meese. He came out of Alameda County. He worked under a DA named Delwyn Lowell Jensen. Jensen would receive what's called an LEAA grant to develop something called DALITE, DALITE, that stands for the District Attorney's Automatic Legal Information System. I bring it up because it's the same software base as Promise. And Colonel, what is Promise?
It's supposedly a software that was stolen by the Department of Department of Justice, and given to both Mossad and the CIA, that was supposedly created to prevent money laundering, which would have rendered everything that we just talked about nil and void. But they didn't use it for that because they set up a back door to it so that they could track everybody else's money laundering and do their own undetected.
So Meese is involved in the legal systems version of the same software. So I thought you'd love that one. So he would join Ronald Reagan's gubernatorial staff in 1967. Here's a fun part of him. He was probably the most instrumental person in the decision to crack down on the student protesters in Berkeley in 1969. So my question for you is, if Meese is already a deep state operative, and we know a certain three-letter agency was promoting the campus action in the 1960s, what gives with that coincidence?
Yeah, I'm going to say it's not a coincidence.
Yeah, it's an interesting connection that Meese was the guy who called that shot, and again to crack down on. Well, it actually makes sense. The CIA wanted the protesters to create a certain impression, a certain narrative, and cracking down on them increases that narrative. So perhaps.
And what was the narrative?
Dissent on the streets. The fact that It was a big answer. Yeah, that's a complex answer.
So I'll give you the uncomplex answer. So because I have looked into this under the guise of where were our Operation Gladio elements here. The entire Weather Underground was our Operation Gladio. The actual disruption on college campuses back during this time frame was legitimate. Had nice iron slacks. They were middle class men and women who didn't want to die in a war in Vietnam over drugs. And they all knew, by the way, exactly why we were there. So the CIA had to implant hippies. And by the way, Doug McGowan documented all of this in the Laurel Canyon episodes, that they actually had fashion designers to create this hippie, the same with makeup artists, hair designers. They crafted the entire thing. It was all an illusion. So
who invented LSD, by the way?
Oh, the CIA.
Yeah.
So the whole thing was orchestrated to make the legitimate anti-war protesters. So now every time you look back at the 1960s and somebody says anti-war protesters, the figment that comes to your imagination are hippies. That's not true at all. That was a psyops. So Ed walks in, Ed Meese walks in, and he cracks down on the things that they created, and the illusion goes on.
Well, the interesting part about it, you described the organic part of the anti-war movement. A lot of that came out of the University of California system. There's a guy by the name of Marcuse, one of the original 9 professors that came over from Frankfurt University to Columbia in 1934. It was that magic year again. And Marcuse's sitting there teaching at UCSD, literally 10 minutes from where I grew up, where I pretty much grew up. And a lot of this movement, the organic side of it, came out of him. This is one of the original cultural Marxists, the people that gave us critical theory and critical race theory. That's where that comes from. So there are definitely different players on the field in the 60s in California.
Yeah.
Where are we talking about? Oh, okay. So Meese joins the Reagan White House as a chief counsel right from almost day one. He also sits on the National Security Council, which means he's got bona fides with the CIA, of course, right?
Yeah.
Meese was very much implicated in Iran-Contra. You familiar with the 1985 Hawk missile transaction? That was Meese. Yeah, Meese is involved in that.
All Operation Gladio.
Yeah. He gets appointed to the U.S. Attorney General in 1985. And interesting, the guy who opposed it vehemently was a guy by the name of Archibald Cox. And if you guys remember Archibald Cox, he was the special prosecutor during Watergate. And his reason for opposition to Edwin Meese was called it due to a lack of ethical sensitivity. That's a direct quote, which means he thought he was scum. So here's where Meese really gets in trouble. This is the #1 law enforcement agent in America. He got involved with a company called Bechtel. And I'm sure yeah. Thought you might like that. So she's laughing because Bechtel's had long-term CIA links. 1978, Mother Jones wrote an article that discussed how they shared Middle East information with the CIA. It's a private company, people. And, what did Bechtel do? They were building, things like projects over in Middle East, whether it be, water reclamation.
They are one of the largest defense contractors that doesn't produce weapon systems, if not the largest every year.
Yeah, so here's an example. They wanted to build a chemical plant in Iraq. Who helped negotiate that? Edwin Meese. When the Bechtel investigation happened, Special Prosecutor James McKay cleared him of wrongdoing, but he criticized him for, and this is a quote, ethical lapses. And again, this is...
Okay, so let me just point out that he currently sits on the board of trustees at the Heritage Foundation with his lack of ethics. And he also was a fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford.
That was my last bullet point for you.
Okay.
And when you hear Hoover Institution, people think CIA.
Everybody that watches my shows knows every one of these stories has a Stanford angle. So thank you for letting me share it.
No, that was gonna be the closing bullet point on this one, but you nailed it. Yeah, he is. And this is 40 years after the fact. He is still sitting on these boards. The Bechtel, he was involved. The Bechtel was involved in the big dig scandal in Boston, a big Bolivian water privatization act. Sound familiar? Um, Tried to build a highway in Kosovo with all kinds of kickbacks. There's an Egyptian kickback scheme with state power contracts. That's what these people do. That's what Bechtel was, and Meese was knee deep with them. He ends up resigning to another company called the WedTech scandal. WedTech is another government contractor. They won a ton of no competitive bids. Funny story about this one. They originally manufactured baby carriages. Pretty darn scary stuff. A guy by the name of John Mariota founds it. Somebody by the name of Fred Newberg comes in, and they started focusing on these DoD contracts. Well, there's a lot of law firms that were involved in this WedTech. When they went public, they gave shares of stock to law firms as payment of services. Mariota was still the primary owner, and he won the competitive bids, even though Newberger was a foreigner. So they were doing this illicitly, getting the government contracts. You had two House members, Mario Biaggi, Robert Garcia, both got resigned seats and went to jail on this scandal. A couple of U.S. senators, Clarence Mitchell, Howard Mitchell, they helped WedTech win the federal work, and they got punished for that. One of the main people at WedTech is a guy by the Major General Vito Castellano. And, he had key positions in Albany, the New York Mafia, or not New York political mafia, I should say. He was the commander of the New York National Guard. He was Mario Cuomo's chief of staff. And Castellano was also the cousin of the Gambino crime boss, Paul Castellano.
I worked with a Castellano at MacDill, and he was an intel officer. I was always harassing about him about being in the mafia.
Yeah, it's real. So that's Meese. And of course, he closed out with, now he's retired. He had to resign when the independent counsel was delivered. But that's this guy. So he's one of the decision makers trying to decide whether we should prosecute BCCI. So do you think with those connections, he might have some incentive with some multinational corporations and other organizations maybe to not pursue further investigation?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. And that's the chief law enforcement action in America. All right, so he's succeeded by a guy by the name of Dick Thornburgh. Not quite as exciting. He was the governor of Pennsylvania, was known as the hero of 3 Mile Island because he was the governor when that happened. He apparently did a good job. He was real big on going after white-collar crime and got a whole lot of convictions during the S&L crisis. Well, that's what the media will tell you, but what do you think about the convictions in the S&L crisis? Did we see some people not get investigated?
All of the real people that served on the boards that got all of the uncollateralized loans, none of them went to jail.
Nah, so we've got a pattern here with Dick Thornburgh.
Oh, what? A pattern?
Nah, never. So he resigns. So he was the Attorney General from 88 to 91. He resigned to become the governor of Pennsylvania. To run for Senate in Pennsylvania. And there was like a side deal cut with a Pennsylvania congressman who was under a campaign finance investigation. He agreed not to run. Well, Gray ends up not winning. He lost to a Democrat. And interesting part about his campaign is 2 years later, his campaign was successfully sued for $180,000 by a guy by the name of Karl Rove. All right, so let's find out what kind of guy was Thornburgh after he was Attorney General. Well, in 2002, he's appointed the examiner of the World Bank bankruptcy proceedings, and he's the guy who slams Arthur Andersen and Citigroup for aiding the fraud.
Okay, hold on. Can I just stop for a second?
Please.
Wasn't Meese Yale and this guy's Yale too?
What's the question?
They're all Yale graduates.
Yeah, I didn't. There's a lot of that, and I didn't write down the college connections.
Okay. Yeah, they're all Yale graduates. Just go ahead.
Yeah, keep that in mind because we got to shift to Skull and Bone soon, and
that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah. No, it's good. When I was going through all the bios of these guys, yeah, an awful lot of Yale connection.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, not a problem. So it's interesting about this guy, Gray, who basically stepped aside to let him run for the Senate seat. Gray ends up being the CEO of the United Negro College Fund, which is an interesting place to land. A little bit of graft has gone through there. The so what's Thornburg doing in the year 2000? He would later serve, after he left the Attorney General, as the United Nations Under Secretary General in 1992 and 93. What's going on in the world in 92, 93? Maybe in Iraq. And that's also the time period where the Cold War is ending and the U.S. foreign policy is shifting from one of alleged defense to shifting to offense, if Mike Benz is to believe. And that's when they started to roll with the censorship, or that's when the internet comes out and some of the what's been known as color revolutions started happening. That was the shift after the Cold War. And this is the guy sitting on the UN as a major player at the time. So a couple other fun things about this guy. He was actually hired by Joe Paterno's family to challenge the free report on Jerry Sandusky. Side note.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, he's a consultant to the United Nations, World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank on efforts to battle fraud and corruption.
So he's the insider on there to make sure they don't ever find anything?
To some degree. I don't think he's all that dirty. I just think he's in some really high positions where he could have done a heck of a lot more if he hadn't turned the other cheek.
Which basically there's those two kinds of people that I've seen. There are ones that are non-controversial that are there as a spy in a business suit. And then there are the ones that are there to, like the Ed Wilsons, to actually get shit done.
The last interesting thing, one last observation about Thornburg and these other gentlemen is, it's amazing. These guys are lawyers. And they end up with positions like with the United Nations or some, and it shows you that the white collar version of international intrigue and espionage really is a legal process. It's lawyer after lawyer. There's a big difference between an attorney general and being a diplomat, and yet somehow these guys are able to leap from one position to another. And
even more so is the CIA agent like William Pauly that becomes an ambassador.
Yeah, what kind of background check did he get through?
All of them.
Apparently.
He's one of them. They do their own.
Well, the attorney general who succeeds Thornburg is a gentleman who does not need much of an introduction. His name is William Barr, also known as Trump's attorney general. He was the AG from 91 to 93, when, again, BCCI is not investigated. And as a friendly reminder, William Barr worked for the CIA from 1971 to 1977.
Correct.
He also, Barr's the guy who justified the U.S. invasion of Panama to arrest Noriega. So he was a hawk on that one.
Oh, yeah. So let me see. I did not look him up in this book, but I want to look real quick while you're on him and see what they say, because they did make an entry on him. Because he shows up in some really interesting times, not necessarily always bad either. So he shows up here in relationship to, let's see, a guy by the name of Jonathan Sloats, and he basically was involved in Bush in some really shady deals with as a government lawyer with the CIA's U.S. Information Agency, the Department of Labor, and NASA. Any place that Bush cronies wanted to do business, the Sloat guy shows up. And it says that a law firm by the name of Shaw, Pittman, Potts, and Trowbridge served as a haven for two key partners that were associated with the private intelligence network that CIA agent Tom Clines worked for, a CIA front company by the name of International Research and Trade. And that was the company that this Ed Wilson guy, who's, part of the weapons deals for BCCI, says that company Ed Wilson funded and Ted Shackley, who's obviously CIA, organized, which became known as EATSCO, EATSCO. a woman by the name of Barbara Saccotti was working in this place. She is a Harvard Law School graduate, and it says Sloat and Roscotti. Let's see. Also working with them was a young man by the name of William Barr. Barr was a New Yorker that had graduated from Columbia University, completed his doctorate degree at George Washington University, and back in 1977 had worked at the Office of the General Counsel to the CIA. In 1982, Barr was appointed Deputy Assistant Director in the Office of Policy Development in the White House. As the sins of the private network were threatening to spill out in public during Bush's own administration, Bush, and they're talking about senior, obviously, turned to Barr to serve first as an Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel in 1988 to 90, and then as his Attorney General. Barr nearly succeeded in covering up the Bush administration's Iraq Gate.
So it's interesting that this is the same Bill Barr that, as you just mentioned, covers up Iraq Gate, did not prosecute BCCI, despite the fact that there was a ton of evidence, as was later exposed. And apparently, when he became Attorney General under Donald Trump, was unable to actually do any kind of investigation into Spygate.
Or election fraud or anything else.
Or anything above. So this guy, Bill Barr is, if he's not the biggest cover-up artist, or maybe that's his entire job is, but.
Well, let me also say there's a separate possibility, and not that I believe this, but it is possible. There are some of these people that were in this system that they are so exposed for things that they have done that they could have been approached saying, because maybe they weren't ready to expose all of the election fraud at the time because they're trying to map a circuit, the network. And there is a slim possibility, because I'm the eternal optimist, that he was brought in as one of them, but wasn't one of them for the legacy of his family.
It's interesting. It's a long conversation with a lot of speculation, but
all speculation.
Yeah. Do we have time for me to jump into the Treasury Secretaries?
Yes,
probably take about 15 minutes. I've got another. I can probably go for another 45 minutes if we need to.
Okay, go.
Okay. So those are your secretaries of state. Attorney generals, the people involved in the cover-up. But most financial crimes investigation starts with the Department of Treasury. That is their expertise, mostly because they've got access to pretty much all kinds of information of money that's coming and going, ones and zeros, and every single banking brokerage entity reports to them. So they've got a lot of data, a lot of investigations start there. But apparently BCCI did not. And let's figure out why. I usually start at the top, and, who makes those decisions. So the U.S. Treasury Secretary in 1985 to August of 1988 is a guy by the name of James Baker. Well known. What's he all about? Well, he was the Undersecretary of Commerce under Ford. He also ran Ford's unsuccessful 1976 election. He would fail upwards and became Reagan's chief of staff in 1984 and 1985. Then in 85, he becomes the Treasury Secretary. So what's he do there? He was the architect of what's called the Plaza Accord. And that's just something that devalued the dollar. It was government intervention into currency markets, and it probably led to the crash of the Japanese asset bubble in the 1980s. This was James Baker. Government intervention into private markets. In my opinion, is a free market type of guy. That's a bit problematic, and we're still seeing the downstream effects of that decision. In Japan, most certainly is. So Baker also comes up with a Baker Plan in 85. It's at a big IMF World Bank meeting, and they're talking about how to combat the international debt crisis. Remember, I've told you that U.S. Treasury is everybody has to own treasuries. So everyone's borrowing in dollars from the World Bank and the IMF. They're unable to pay those back. They're having to hoard treasuries as their only stable currency, and it's a problem. So Baker comes up with a plan to use China's trade surplus to relieve some of this third world debt. that's what the headlines will tell you. What's really going on is they're further enslaving these poorer countries to the dollar debt system, which is the predicate for the Gladio-style multinational corporations moving into the NGOs, everything like that. If the government and these indebted nations do not play ball, well, that's when we bring in the NGOs and the CIA. So that's what's really going on with the IMF banking stuff.
So let me tie him in a little further. Baker. Well, Baker's from Houston. All of the players of BCCI, that Mahoud guy, that's the banker for the Saudi family, that was one of the primary funders of BCCI. He has an operation in Houston, Texas, weirdly enough. And they use a guy by the name of, let me find his name. I just lost it. His last name's Bath. I'm trying to find his first name. It's B-A-T-H, James Bath. James Bath is a very interesting guy because he becomes the conduit between the Bush oil and the Saudi oil. And he's involved in a thing with all of them, to include Baker, by the way, called the Safari Club. And all of this has everything to do with the tie-in of Saudi. It says in 1979, James Bath was much more than a well-connected oil dealmaker. He also invested money in George W. Bush's fledgling oil company, Arbrusco Energy. In 1980, Bath, who had been known as the younger Bush since the two of them had served together in the Texas Air National Guard in the early 70s, went into business together with the Arbrusco. At the time, Bath was the U.S. representative of Salam bin Laden, Osama's eldest brother, at the head of the Saudi business empire. Bath had a similar arrangement with Sheikh Khalid bin Mafsoud, which is the banker to the Saudi royal family behind the BCCI funding. Bin Mafsoud was the key figure in BCCI. Young George Bush had already ran for Congress and lost before he established himself as an awful businessman with no success in oil fields. By the time James Bath made his investment, two things about the younger Bush had become clear. He had a serious substance abuse, and he had trouble remembering who had invested in his deals. He also had an acknowledged drinking problem. And it goes on to say, this Bath guy, it says Bath had no money. He was not inherently rich. So he basically took aircraft and retrofitted them for the Saudi family and others in the Middle East. So he was flipping airplanes. Like we flip houses, he was flipping airplanes. And like with millions of dollars of upgrades, right? So he's conduiting into many different companies, to include one that BCCI underwrites to get nuclear switches in a company in Texas sent over to Pakistan's nuclear program. This guy is the dealer that's doing all of this shit, this Bath guy. And he's doing it with BCCI money from the Saudis into the Bush family.
Yeah, and it's funny how that ties all the way back, because Meese has from the opposite direction, has connections to the Bush family.
And James Baker from Houston goes into business. What's the name of that company that him and George Sr. forms in Washington, D.C., the private equity company?
We're not. I was looking at. I was going to go with Enron next, but
Carlyle.
Oh, that one. Okay.
And what does Carlyle do right off the bat? Buys a large equity share in all of the military-industrial complex right before what happens? The Iraq War.
Interesting business model. A little inside information going on there at all?
Yeah.
So now we're making a connection to BCCI through the Bushes, James Baker. So does he have any incentive to not prosecute at BCCI, because maybe it might find its way back to some names that don't need to be uncovered.
I just showed you the names that doesn't need to be uncovered, which is why I wanted to say that.
So it's, he ends up, we talked about the Baker plan. He would end up managing Bush's campaign in '88, and he won, and immediately becomes the Secretary of State. Now, we know quite well that if you talk about Secretary of State, you're talking about the official arm that the CIA is the unofficial arm of. They are the same, CIA. Correct. And Secretary. Yeah, so if you're the Secretary of State, you know where the bodies are buried.
Correct.
Interesting that he was there from '89 to '92, because that's when the Soviet Union's breaking up, and James Baker is running point while we're orchestrating the giveaway of all the Russian government assets to a bunch of oligarchs. And Baker's out there publicly saying the whole quote, "Not 1 inch closer will NATO encroach upon Russia." So that's Baker for you. Well, a couple more things on Baker. He was a UN envoy to Western Sahara. Interesting, because we've seen a little bit of shenanigans there, have we not?
Quite a few, actually.
Yeah. He was also a big consultant to Enron prior to that Enron bankruptcy. And of course, he managed Bush's team. He managed Bush's team in the younger Bush in the Florida recount. What he's doing now, he sits on something called a board of the World Justice Project, and of course, the Climate Leadership Council,
which is another money laundering operation.
Well, of course, But okay, so there's your Secretary of the Treasury with connections. He's got all kinds of incentives to not investigate BCCI. Would you agree?
Yes.
So who takes over from him for a brief period? And it's worth mentioning because he was only there for a month. Was a guy by the name of M. Peter McPherson, and this is 1988, August to September. And what's going on with the BCCI case during that period? Remind me when the big arrest sting happened. What year was that? Oops, are you muted? Oh, the Colonel disappeared on me. Interesting.
Hey,
thanks for sharing. Hey, you're back.
When I first started this crap, I've never had computer problems. That's why I sends everything to Apple. And since I've been doing Operation Gladio, I have the freakiest things happening to my computer. My whole computer just went black. I have no idea why. It's not like it's out of battery charge. I don't know. I went and grabbed my husband's computer and I logged on to this because I had the link that I had sent to you, and it wouldn't recognize me as the host. I logged into as myself. And it's like, you're backstage waiting for the host. And I'm like, no, I am the host.
Yeah, I was looking at the stage. I couldn't see it. I didn't.
Oh my God.
Well, welcome back. I was able to entertain everybody, answer some questions in Rumble for about 10 minutes. And
awesome. Sorry about that.
No, I was giving you a couple more minutes. Welcome back. I will. I have the pleasure. I'll be able to edit that portion out when I put this video up tomorrow. So.
Well, my audience is used to it. This happens to me all the time.
Technology is your friend. Embrace it. So I think I left off. I was just. Oops. Let me find where I was in my notes. I was just finishing up with
Baker.
Yeah, Baker. So let me get back to that. I only have 16 pages of notes on this topic, so it's kind of hard to find my way around. All right, the next later person who was the Secretary of Treasury for that 1 month in August of '88, and you cut off right when I was asking you what else was going on in August, September of 1988 regarding the BCCI investigation. Because what was the date of the raid where they took the wedding raid on BCCI?
I don't have those notes in front of me. Let's see. What did I do with my notes?
I believe it was '88.
I think you're right.
But it's interesting. It's interesting that M. Peter McPherson, not a household name. I'm guessing most people have never even heard of this guy.
Go ahead and I'll look it up while you're talking.
Well, he was an IRS specialist in international taxation. So it sounded like he has the perfect portfolio to understand what was going on with BCCI. He previously was a Ford administrator deputy director for the Presidential Personnel Office, where he worked side by side with Dick Cheney.
Whoa. What?
Yes, in the Ford administration, McPherson worked side by side with Dick Cheney, the Prince of Darkness himself.
And in the office that, for those of you who don't know what he just said, that does all the background screening on everybody. So they would know who everybody is because they have access to the top level of every kind of computer system to check everybody out. Go ahead.
Bingo. And he's working side by side with Dick Cheney.
Who also would have had that same access.
Yes. So the next job he has is he's the administrator for a U.S. agency from 1981 to 1987. The name of that agency is USAID.
Oh, CIA.
Well, yes. How does the State Department fund everything, all these quasi-covert operations in the NGOs? It's all through the USAID. This is McPherson for 7 years in the 80s. What's going on in the 80s? Iran-Contra.
1988, you were right.
Yep, thought so. So the timing of all this is they're shifting people in and out of Treasury and the U.S. Attorney's Office all during that period.
Almost like they want no continuity.
Well, yeah, you also want plausible deniability. Meese didn't want anything to do. Yeah, go figure. So he then goes to oversee something called the OPIC, OPIC. Are you familiar with that one?
I came across that. Tell me what it is.
It wasn't around for long. It's called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and its mandate was to help U.S. businesses, listen to this, gain footholds in emerging markets.
So it's another CIA front.
Well, you ready for this? It was self-funded and quote-unquote self-funded, and it would end up being merged into USAID.
Oh, yeah. That's where I heard it from. Yeah. So that was the precursor that the self-funding come from the oligarchs to go in and buy up everything after they couped the government that their stooge was going to privatize. That's what that was for. And
McPherson is running this. He would then go on to become the chairman of the Dow Jones. Yeah, the Dow Jones Company. A little more fun here. From 2006 to 2022, this guy sat, and this is something we need to dig into. He sat as the chair of the Association of Public Land Grant Universities. And his big goal was to increase, quote, college access and eliminate achievement gap. That's part of the DEI stuff for the government was putting down. He sat on that. So also that would have made him the conduit of the CIA into those universities, both on the staff and for recruiting purposes. Yeah, there's a deep, when you start getting into Public Land Grant Universities Association, there is a deep rabbit hole. I've only scratched the surface. Okay. But we could probably spend weeks on that if we ever had the time. That controls an awful lot of quasi-government funding. And they determine, I don't know, who sits who's the president of every department. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. They put CIA agents. I mean, that's how they did the whole Phoenix program, was they hired the entire staff of the University of, Michigan State University. Yeah, it's exactly embedded in all of them. It's basically what Fauci did, in terms of with his departments, the U.S. whatever. Yeah. So that's Mr. McPherson, and I would suggest that his connections are deep enough to think that he might have had an incentive to cover up the BCCI scandal. Probably. I got one more for you. Okay. Secretary of the Treasury from 1988 through 1993. So which means he ended with Clinton inauguration. This guy by the name of Nicholas Brady. And I really wish he had a different last name because he pops up in my life way too often. He was, once upon a time, he was the long-term chairman of Dillon Read and Company, which is a storied Wall Street bank. Yeah, that comes up all the time. Go ahead, jump into it. There's more. Well, I mean, just from the perspective of like they're like a modern day Sullivan and Cromwell. They come up in a lot of the international deals where representing these entities that are not good entities. Yeah, they would have been a quasi on the same level as a Lehman Brothers or a those type of banks. They spent a lot of time in international. Kuhn Loeb would have been a competitor. a lot of these old Wall Street banks, these are the banks that were funneling money.
Well, I was thinking that was the law firm. Sorry.
No, yeah, this is an investment bank.
Okay.
They
has a similar name. That's one of the law firms that keeps coming up.
Go ahead and find it, and you can jump in when you want. So what else is Nicholas Brady do? Well, he's a Reagan appointee for the quote unquote Commission on Salaries. When he becomes the Treasury Secretary, he is the one who launched the Brady Plan. That's why I can't stand the guy. I hate hearing my name and not talking about me. And he's the one who created what's called the Brady bonds. These are international U.S. Treasury-backed bonds that they issued to third world countries, borrowers from the U.S. from the United States, IMF, World Bank, and they were a way for third world countries to finance themselves with the auspices of U.S. backing. This replaced the Baker Plan with middling success. Since '94, he's been the chairman of Franklin Templeton, which is a big investment management firm. Used to be bigger than BlackRock. He's the director. You're going to love this one, of Hess Corporation. Where do we know Hess Corporation from?
I don't know. Remind me.
Oil and gas exploration and production.
Yeah. Okay.
They were a contractor out of Iraq. In Iraq.
Yeah. Got it. Hess Oil. Yeah.
And yeah, he also was a director of a company called Weatherford International, which is another oil field services. Since 2004, they were doing a ton of work in Iraq. And what he's been doing the last 15, 20 years, he's been a trustee at Rockefeller University. And for those who don't recall, Rockefeller University is the oldest biomedical research institute in the United States, and I would say the world. And he sits on their board. So that is Mr. Nicholas Brady, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, who also declined any real prosecutions of BCCI in the early 90s.
He's also Yale.
Yeah, of course. It was going to be over and over again. It's an old boys club.
He was also on the MITRE Corporation, which, by the way, CIA, and he was a director at the Heinz Corporation, like Teresa Heinz, like Kelly Teresa Heinz,
who John Kerry married, and of course John Kerry was leading the Senate investigation into BCCI.
It's such a small family.
Well, you know what's funny is that, I was looking at John Kerry, and of course when I was doing the Skull and Bones research, and I was wondering if there are any more connections to John Kerry. There's someone else by the last name of Heinz who is an older Skull and Bones alumni. So I have not unpeeled that one yet, but I think there's something there.
Teresa Heinz's husband?
Yes, it's John Kerry, of course, but
no, she was married to Heinz. That's how she got the inheritance.
Okay, so would have been her father or grandfather would have been or uncle had some kind of Skull and Bones connection. I need to verify that, and that's been a while since I went and looked for that. But there is a Heinz listed on the Skull and Bones roster.
Yeah, so Heinz is what is her married name. That's not her maiden name.
So she married into the Heinz fortune?
Yes.
And then inherited it herself?
Yes, and her first husband was in the Senate and mysteriously died. Did you not know that?
I am.
Hold on. I got to pick this up because this is crazy. Okay, John Heinz. Yeah, John Heinz. Oh my God, he died in 1991. No shit. Okay, so yeah, John Heinz. Yeah, he's from Yale as well. John Heinz III, heir to the H.J. Heinz Company. Heinz moved to San Francisco with his mother and stepfather, U.S. Navy Captain Clayton Monty Macaulay, blah, blah, blah. Oh, and so, another childhood tragedy of not having the family together. They all have this typical background. So he becomes senator, and he faced Arlen Specter in his successful Senate run, and he came under fire for illegal donations to Gulf Oil, which he got donations from Gulf Oil. He returned them. Hines would defeat Specter in the primary, blah, blah, blah. He goes on. He sits on, oh my gosh, he sat on the Committee for Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, on the Committee on Finance, and also the National Commission on Social Security Reform. So, yeah, he was a big deal. And then it says Hines and 6 other people, including 2 children, were killed in a Bell helicopter and a Piper Airstar mid-air collision. And there was a lot of speculation that that was not a coincidence. And it says, following the funeral in Pittsburgh, a Washington, D.C. memorial was held in which President George H.W. Bush attended, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, a big deal. And then Teresa Hines, his widow, goes on to marry John Kerry.
And Teresa Hines was 5.5 years older than John Kerry at the time. So here we have John Kerry, a very successful, prominent person, somehow single, and he decides to marry for pure love someone 5 years older than him. You would think it would be the other direction. That's not the typical behavior. So obviously he married for money and power. But yeah,
obviously,
yeah, we're gonna have to have more fun with that particular corner when we get into Skull and Bones.
Yeah, because she has some very interesting background. Her parents were from Portuguese colony Mozambique. And there's all kinds of international intrigue with her, Teresa Hines. And so it's almost like she's a handler. Just going to throw that out there. When you look at her background.
Yeah, there could be there's been enough whispers of that and connections that's worth looking into. I'd mentioned earlier that Baker was the UN envoy to Western Sahara, and I don't have the exact year of that. I'm trying to find that because Western Sahara's got some interesting Gladio type conversations about it. Have you ran into that one yet?
Oh yeah, we went over all of the pretty much the entire continent of Africa in general. Let me pull this up.
Well, then you, I, and Gordon, Ghost to Base Patrick Henry, talked about the more recent Gladio efforts going on in Africa, like especially the Congo.
Correct.
What's going on there? But
so, go ahead.
I was going to say Western Sahara is something that's pops up on the radar about once a decade, and I want to double check the dates. But if Baker was there at a certain period of time, I think there's more there than meets the eye that I have not looked into yet.
Yeah, there was lots of shenanigans going on in Western Sahara, especially in some of their border areas. When we talked about them, I don't know how you say the country that's right next to it, Mauritania.
Mauritania. Interesting. Mauritania has been in the news the last 3 days.
Yeah.
Because the Mauritanian illegal immigrant who actually murdered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that has went on in that area.
Very, very, very poor part of the world. Maybe as poor as it gets is that area we're talking about.
Yeah. Which is weird. Although a lot of the corporations like Goodyear for rubber, that's a great place for the rubber industry. That's what we found in Angola and various other parts of the eastern seaboard of Africa. Goodyear, Goodrich, they all had rubber plantations over there that they were exploiting the workers.
So you mean that a country that had cheap resources and cheap labor might get exploited by a multinational corporation, and that's the reason their people are still poor?
I can't even imagine that.
Well,
is that like modern day colonialism?
It might be. Just mercantilism, different flavor of imperial, different. It's always
use the CIA and NGOs as opposed to the State Department and the corporations or the countries actually owning them in the past.
Hey, I'm coming up on my time limit, and I don't have anything else prepared for today. Do you want to wrap up or bring home the big picture we talked about today? And are we going to do Skull and Bones next week?
No, not yet, unless you want to do it at a different time. Because I do have at least one or two more that I want to do on the criminality of BCCI, the actual weapons deals, the actual banking locations, people that they had on their boards, and kind of delve into that. I'll get you an outline in the next couple of days that'll just kind of give an overview of that segment, because literally everything that went on, all of the dictators had accounts there, all of the Iraq illegal weapons, and as I mentioned, the triggers that the entire Pakistani government's defense department was supplied through money coming out of BCCI. The nuclear triggers to put on their tactical nuclear weapons was financed by BCCI.
Of course. Yeah, that'll be fun. That's definitely next week. That's all depends on what happens with the election on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Depending on what happens, we may divert attention to more immediate matters and looking into the history. So we pencil in next Thursday?
Yeah.
Very good. Well, let's wrap up what we talked about today. If you want to give a summary.
I think you're the best one to give the summary since you're the one that come up with it. I mean, in my opinion, that's the reason why you and I sat down to do this. Your extensive banking background is like the picture mirror of my military dig into Gladio. And because nothing that the Gladio operation could have been done without the banking element.
Yeah, you can't have one. You cannot have one without the other.
Correct. And so that's why when you and I first talked about doing this together, it was like the match made in heaven, because I can talk to, and I think we've laid all of the groundwork out in the actual banking elements of it. And then we're going to transition to the military, the militant, the paramilitary aspect of this bank, because it wasn't a bank. It was actually a bank posing as a weapons dealer, a human trafficker, and a drug trafficker. And we're going to lay that out in the next two shows.
Yeah, the takeaway I would give everybody is don't think about a bank as a bank. Don't think about the banking system. What it is a network of all different kinds of banks, some of them pristine, doing things correctly, some of them doing completely underworld stuff. Caught in the middle of that is all of our regulators, which basically are what they decide to regulate and what they decide to turn a blind eye to are determined for political purposes. Now you recognize why it is that our politicians are not really organic grassroots people that the people love, but they are selected by the power brokers, the multinational corporations that have the money. They have to put their people in power so that they can have the bottlenecks of all of these regulatory positions. And they have to have the regulators to give the appearance of authenticity. But I think we've done a good job today of exposing that some of the most decorated law enforcement and Treasury officials in history have connections that are definitely worth questioning. And they tie all the way back to some of the shadiest parts of America's foreign policy and the entire international criminal syndicate.
So all along just reminded me that Senator Towers' plane crash happened right around the same time as Senator Hines' plane crash. And he believes that they were in the same type of aircraft. Obviously, two separate instances, but that because the Tower Commission is the one that was investigating the Iran-Contra affair.
It's funny. I was in college when that stuff happened, so I paid attention to part of it. I really started paying attention in 1990, and I haven't told this story on the air before. Do you remember the gentleman by the name of Ian Spiro?
Yes.
Ian Spiro was a multinational businessman who had some interesting combinations. He apparently murdered and killed his entire family in Rancho Santa Fe, California in 1990, I believe it was. His wife, who I will tell you right now, he did not murder, was my mom's tennis partner. I know the Spiro family. Those kids we've had over at our house. We've had holidays with those people. That was a Middle East hit team in the middle of San Diego. And that's when I started digging into the Middle East connections all the way back in 1990. And I'm in college at the time. So, the resources, you had to go into the newspaper and read through all the different newspapers because the local's not covering it. But yeah, that was absolute. If you ever want to look up a real live hit, happened in Rancho Santa Fe, California. And I'm telling you right now, I knew Ian Spiro. He did not murder his family. These are good people. He just got ticked off the wrong Middle East business partners. And I got kind of cut off at my research back at the time. The internet wasn't really around. But I'm going back and taking a look at that one again. And it does tie into some of the things we're talking about. So this one is actually personal to me.
Yeah, and you have the guy that was down in North Carolina that was part of the Fort Bragg crew that was charged. He was a doctor. He was charged with murdering his family and 2 little girls. This happens, and we just had the Menendez brothers, right? That they supposedly was convicted of killing their parents, only to find out the parents really they were into the child molestation, and that's coming out. So I say this almost daily now. Our entire history is a lie.
An awful lot of it is. And it all comes down to who writes the history.
The winners do. The ones not put in jail.
Yeah,
getting back to the start of the program. But okay, so we're going to call it a day for today. That was quite a lot of information. Probably going to have to play this a couple of different times to get all the names. And we are planning on doing one next Thursday, but it may be preempted. And so just hang with us. If we don't do it next Thursday, we'll, and maybe we could record one to play next Thursday. We'll check our schedules and figure that part out. But also, worst case scenario, we'll do it the following Thursday. And we're going to really dig into the criminality piece of BCCI and the last 2 that we do.
Yeah, I just hope the internet survives the post-election riots. They're coming to a street near you. No, I really hope that doesn't happen. But
the fascist dictator's not going to shut the internet down.
I tell you, everybody, if you are not prepped by next Tuesday, you've probably missed your window. I mean, I've got months of food supply, water supply, pew. I am concerned about what happens after this election. So.
I think there's reason to be concerned, but I also believe that has been anticipated. So,
well, I hope you are correct.
We shall see.
Until the next time, thanks for having me, Colonel.
Thank you, Brady, very much for being here. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time.